Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4, where we're returning to our friend Sidney Mintz and his book Sweetness and Power. And we're going to dig more deeply into his work both this week and next week, and really covering these chapters that he has on sugar production, sugar consumption, and power that comes from sugar. And we'll really only have a chance to get into the production side of things this week, and that's chapter 2 in the book. So this video is going to really focus on some of the content that we have for that and get us ready to talk about some of the different arguments that he makes and some of the examples that he presents in class. As I've emphasized before in class, Sweetness and Power is a really foundational work in food studies. He's an anthropologist and was really one of the first scholars to really make this kind of argument that a particular crop or commodity or food system changed the world in some way. Now you can find all kinds of books on this. You can read about how salt changed the world and how bread changed the world and how beer changed the world, and you name it. There's probably a book out there if you can think of any different type of food. But Mintz in the 80s was one of the first people to really focus on how this particular commodity, sugar, led to this system of changes, or I guess you could say was part of this system of changes, and really helped facilitate in a lot of ways what we think of as the world today and the way we eat food and the way we consume sugar in particular. And so his story is really not only the story of sugar, but it's about kind of the making of modernity in the modern world and a lot of the different aspects that we think of it. We don't necessarily think of sugar as fundamental for that, but if you think about how central sugar is in our lives, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, Mintz himself provides some data on this. It really is this staple. And so part of the assumption is that we can't really see where we are right now without seeing how this particular food and the food systems around it, all the politics, culture, economics, and ecological shifts that are part of the rise of sugar as this major food staple in our lives, is part of that process. And so in a way, what we're finding is how sugar itself became a food. How is it that it became a staple? We've talked before when we read Mintz's first chapter about the different staples and sauce systems that are part of world food systems. So you've got the staples like rice and millet and corn, stuff like that, the big 7 crops that form the key world staples. Well, in the modern world, we've added to that in some ways, and sugar in particular has become this real staple that it's kind of hard for many of us to live without now. And even if we try to avoid sugar, it's become so ubiquitous in our food that it's hard to get away from. There's all kinds of details about all those connections, and we're going to be diving into those both in class this week as well as next. And especially this week, we're really going to be looking at the way in which early capitalism developed through the plantation system. This connects back to the topic we talked about before last week when we talked about the Plantationocene and how plantation systems and the labor politics and the power dynamics that are inherent in that particular system of production really led to a set of relationships in the modern world that are problematic in many ways, but also help explain our current world situation and a lot of the issues that we're struggling to come to grips with right now. So, wrap it all up. Sugar is this really interesting, important story that kind of helps tell us where we are today and how we got here. So to follow up in a little bit more detail on some of those points on the prior slide and to start to get into Mintz's case, again, to really kind of kickstart some of the discussion that we can have in class this week, we can ask about why sugar. And the story that Mintz tells early in his chapter and really helps kind of go through the production and the consumption chapters is about the story of sugar being a rare spice early in the story that he tells, so 16th, 17th centuries, to becoming something really ubiquitous that's in every aspect of our food. And he gives some stats on page 67 where he shows that at the early 18th century, the early 1700s, sugar consumption included only just a few pounds a year per capita, in other words, per person in England at that time. So around 1700 or so, the English were consuming maybe somewhere around 2, 3, 4 pounds of sugar per year. And that really skyrockets through that century into the early 1800s, early 19th century. You've got people having more like 18 pounds, 20 pounds of sugar per year. And again, as we'll talk about as we get more into the consumption chapter next week, there is a real shift in terms of who's doing that consumption as well, that it moves from an elite, mainly an elite market, to a more widespread market that includes the working class. So we can ask the question, how much sugar do you think we consume in the US today? Think about it for a minute. What would you guess? Probably guess more than 18, but how much more than 18 do you think? Per capita, in other words, again, per person, do each of us consume per year? Well, it's a little hard to get a precise answer because it depends on kind of how you slice it, how you divide up the sugar consumption. But depending on how you measure it, we each consume per capita about 90 to 150 pounds of sugar per year. And part of the reason there's that range is if you're talking about sugars that are added to foods, and that's actually kind of on the lower end. That kind of 90 is that a big chunk of the sugar that we eat is actually added to foods, including foods that we don't necessarily think of as sweet or having sugar in them. A good example being like pasta sauce. If you look at jarred pasta sauces at the grocery store, one of the first ingredients on the list after water and tomatoes is going to be sugar. They put a lot in there, and some of it, if you haven't tried it in a while, and you've had other types of pasta sauce that are kind of more homemade or from scratch, and you try one of those jarred sauces, you'll realize just how sweet it is. It's kind of like eating a candy bar or something like that. Same thing with like pizza sauces. If you go to a place like Pizza Hut, Domino's, they're really sweet sauces too. There's a ton of sugar in them. And all kinds of foods are like this. Again, even if you don't think you're eating candy, in some ways you kind of are. So that's that lower end that, just if you have those added sugars, it's a lot. But then the sugars that we add intentionally to, putting in our morning coffee or sprinkling on our cornflakes, whatever else that we eat in terms of our sugar consumption, it's probably well over 100 pounds per year if you add all that up. A lot of that is not necessarily in the form of white sugar or table sugar. A lot of it's actually made from corn in the form of high fructose corn syrup. So you'll see that ingredient too on a lot of different things. So overall, we've gone from this rarity of sugar being something that was really precious and like a spice that you could spend a lot of money on if you were wealthy, to something where we don't even hardly think about it. Sugar is just everywhere. We're kind of swimming in it as part of our food system. Now, despite that fact that sugar is everywhere, Mintz is really emphasizing, especially again early on in the production chapter, that sugar is actually hard to get. It's not something that we can just grow on a tree and harvest and eat directly. Sugar actually is a really complex product that's part of a production system involving a lot of different technologies, a lot of different stages and processes that you have to go through to take something like sugar cane or sugar beet and actually process it into some kind of raw sugar or refined sugar that you can use for direct consumption or that you can add to products. And so we have these really intense ways in which we react to sugar biologically through our tastes and the things that it triggers in our body, and then obviously culturally too. But it's not something that we can easily get without going through all those steps and all the technology that's involved with it. In a lot of ways, sugar production in the colonies influenced industrial production in the colonizing states, is something that Mintz also emphasizes in terms of sugar being labor intensive. This labor system required the use of slave labor in the colonies, and in tandem, the rise of the working class in places like England, who really became dependent on sugar as part of their diet. Again, that's something we'll get to when we talk a little bit more about the consumption chapter next week. But there's this really strong connection between Mintz's story about the rise of sugar production in the colonies and the rise of the industrial working class in the colonizing states, like especially England. So in a lot of ways, he's talking about how England, as this colonizing power that goes into places like especially the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, some of the other sugar producing island states that he talks about in this chapter, are really interconnected there, and that these two labor systems are really hard to disentangle from each other in this time period. And overall, by looking at sugar, who eats it, why do they eat it, in what forms, and how much, we can learn a lot about where we are today and how we got here. So that leads us to a couple of key discussion topics that we can pick up in class. So let's talk more about this idea of slave labor being really central to the development of sugar as a commodity, but also more broadly, the questions about how capitalism began and what are the roots of capitalism and its basis in a system of slave labor and slave production, and including the triangles of trade. That's something we'll go into more in class, but how did those triangles of trade work? What were the components of them, including the fact that slaves were a really central part of that commodity system and the exchange there. And then the last question, there's a little bit of jargon there about the center and periphery, and I'll explain that more in class, but overall, the connection between the colonizing countries and the colonized, and what was the direction of exchange there? Was it really just about the colonizers kind of controlling the colonized, or were there ways in which the process of sugar and other kind of what Mintz calls agro-industrial systems influenced the development of capitalism in the colonizing states like England? Those are all topics that we'll talk about in class. See you then.